As I speak to you today, my own state of Kerala is just going through another devastating episode of widespread heavy rains and severe flooding, much like we've had to suffer in 2018 and 2019. Episodes which left us facing immense pain, human displacement, colossal damage, and tragic loss of life. The Kerala floods of 2018 were described as the worst in a century. But floods almost as bad occurred the very next year, and a new round seems to have begun 2 years later. We find ourselves asking whether this is now going to be a recurring tragedy. If it is, it threatens a region of colossal importance to the rest of the world, the Indian Ocean region, which itself comprises 20% of the world's oceans and also amounts to 40% of the global coastline, 66,500 kilometers, connecting 36 countries and 2/3 of the whole world's population. Now, these recent events have forced us to face an inescapable reality. The Indian Ocean region, which, as I said, hosts 2/3 of the world's population, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and extreme weather conditions. Kerala and many other parts of peninsular India may have to live with much more flooding in the years immediately ahead. It also has terrible consequences for the global community, with temperature disturbances in our backyard having manifestations in severe events in other parts of the world, including recent flooding and landslides in East Africa and bushfires in Australia. For hundreds of years, the Indian Ocean has been the site of naval battles, movements of migration, and commercial trade, a place of great cultural interaction and military conflict, as well as of the moving syncretism of the exchanges of culture and belief. As the rains flood the hills, plains, and rivers of Kerala today, it's vital to realize there's something even bigger at stake. The vast expanse of ocean within which we are located must be safeguarded, not just from military aggression, but even more from environmental degradation that threatens us all. To put it plainly, the challenges of climate change and the array of solutions proposed under the umbrella term sustainable development are no longer an abstract or a theoretical concept to the people of Kerala, who've been confronted by visuals of swirling floodwaters, of homes that have housed generations being swept away, and of an almost annual upheaval in our regular lives. It's now an existential question, a question of the very survival of our society. It's clear that business as usual is no longer an acceptable approach. So while sustainable development could once have been dismissed as an elaborate academic concept that got in the way of quicker solutions that offered immediate results, we now know that unless we can sustain what we build, then building itself will not serve any purpose, not only in the long term, but also in our very near and visible future in the coming years. What once seemed a faraway possibility is now at our doorstep. We must, as citizens and corporations in a globalized world, address this reality. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which replace the Millennium Development Goals, as adopted when I was there at the UN, brings together 169 targets and 17 objectives that member states must aim to achieve by 2030. This makes them perhaps the most comprehensive, and some would say the most ambitious global goals to which the world has ever committed. Now, whether or not we can pull it off will need to be seen. But to help us make significant inroads towards attaining these goals, it's clear that every section of society, the corporate sector, civil society organizations, and government itself must come together and synchronize their approach, particularly in a manner that redefines the way we view progress and development. One such definition, one such approach worth revisiting today is the triple bottom line, an accounting framework developed by the famous British entrepreneur John Elkington in 1994. At its core, the framework has sought to align the value of a business with a new understanding of progress and development, recognizing that business has a responsibility not just to shareholders, but also to the rest of us, stakeholders across the board. Under the triple bottom line, the value and success of a business is judged not against only familiar indicators such as financial performance, but also in terms of social and environmental parameters, making a marriage of 3 Ps: profit, planet, and people. So triple bottom line essentially tells us that companies, and I must keep stressing societies also, must prepare 3 different and separate bottom lines, where the profit and loss statement, and in the case of a society maybe the GDP statement, is only one component of this broader concept and not the defining parameter of the success of the enterprise. The other 2 parameters or bottom lines are a people's account, that is a measure of the social responsibility of the company as it conducts business, and the planet account, where the environment and long-term sustainability goals are met. If a company is destroying its environment, the profit line is not good enough. Now that's very important to understand, because we need to move much more in the direction of the triple bottom line. The manner in which the global economy has evolved is such that too much emphasis is laid on economics itself, even as natural and social capital is eroded indiscriminately. This is why some countries are focused on gross national happiness rather than just gross national product. If you cut a tree, that increases your GDP, but it hurts your environment. How do you measure the value of that? Globalization has generated much wealth, and millions have been lifted out of poverty in the 20th century. But as we approach the threshold of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the gap between the rich and the poor is widening, and more wealth is cornered by a small minority at great cost to the majority. This also works against the principle of sustainable development. Development, after all, is not merely about numbers and abstraction. It's about people. It's about what purpose those numbers serve and whom they serve. Development is not about numbers, it's about people. Economic growth cannot be a goal in itself if it also does not guarantee social cohesion through equitable distribution of wealth, an efficient welfare system that protects the weakest in our societies, a health and education infrastructure for our young to bring forth their best productive output, and a natural environment without which all of these other efforts would ultimately prove to be futile. Addressing this, I know, remains easier said than done. And while nobody can have any quarrel with the principles in question, one knows in politics, implementation is another matter altogether. It is much more convenient to assess growth in numbers. Once you add human, environmental, social elements to the formula, you're complicating the whole affair. And of course, you're bringing on board concepts and perspectives that people, government, media are simply not used to. Old habits die hard. And it's no wonder that we've been slow to embrace in practice this kind of triple bottom line approach to sustainable development. Now, I'm not blaming companies for seeking to stick to these economic considerations. Even the most benign capitalistic enterprises realize this would limit the conversation to investments, return on profits, salaries paid, jobs created, income distributed, and adding one more element, the environment, would mean having to acknowledge issues like water quality, energy usage, waste produced and waste disposal, and so on, which would paint a much less rosy picture than the economic figures normally deployed. Now, this is where government and civil society have a role to play, to ensure that corporations can do good for the communities in which they function and the context within which they function, even as they do well for themselves. You can do good and do well at the same time. What's needed is, to begin with, a realignment even of government policy and the way government understands growth. At the same time, this is not to suggest that the private sector should be shackled and prevented from achieving its full potential. On the contrary, it's merely to promote the fair principle that the private sector, beyond producing goods and services and keeping the economic engine running, must work within a framework of social responsibility, making its own contributions to good governance, to innovation, and maintaining more than transactional relations with its employees, its business partners, the clients and consumers, and the communities in which these businesses function. Now, there are, of course, certain advocacy groups that feel that sustainability initiatives should not be voluntary, that civil society must lobby for mandatory, legal triple bottom line audits. This may still be far away, it may be a hard sell, but let me tell you that industry and corporations would probably object to such demands right off the bat. But once we move communities, citizens, interest groups into this process, frameworks could be developed in the coming years that really oblige corporations and governments to take the triple bottom line seriously. 3 governments have actually issued a happiness budget: New Zealand, the UAE, and Bhutan. They're talking about not just the regular financial budget, but a budget that measures the happiness quotient in their societies. Now, let's say that we know we can't dragoon companies into this. There's never going to be enough NGO potential to police the corporations or to channel public opinion campaigns towards these goals. What we need instead is a more accommodative building up of awareness of the triple bottom line and to shift the ethical narrative in its favor, which would naturally then oblige companies, businesses, and governments to do better. A public-private model of sorts can help our communities make these transitions. And while civil society and the NGO sector represent the public, the government can be the bridge connecting the private sector to them through the right legislation and frameworks that do not hinder business potential, even while protecting the rights of citizens and communities. Government must intervene in the interests of society, just as, for instance, it does in the case of health and medication in India. We produce generic drugs, for example, and though this stands in the way of profits and a number of orthodox business principles, the social advantages of cheaper generic drugs override such demands. So too, when moving to a sustainable economic world order, government must be unbending where principle is concerned for the larger good that goes beyond immediate profit. Now, sustainability may sound like an onerous proposition that'll slow us down and get in the way of doing things successfully and so on, but in reality, we really are at a moment in history when we must take a leap from the way things were to the way they should be, making sustainable development and the triple bottom line our guiding principles as we build our collective future. Let's all work for that. Jai Hind.